Hello and welcome to Money Reimagined. I'm Michael Casey. Today we're talking about blockchain interoperability. It might seem like an arcane topic at first glance, but for anyone interested in the future of the internet and in the prospect for a more decentralized digital economy, it's a vital one. Long ago in crypto time, there was only one blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain. It was a single record of truth for all Bitcoin transactions, with the blockchain ledger's entries open for all to see and recorded and validated by a network of miners. Each following the incentives and instructions of the Bitcoin protocol, users could transact peer-to-peer without relying on what Satoshi Nakamoto called trusted third parties. There were no gatekeeping intermediaries inside each transaction, and no one could censor the ledger. Then came Peercoin and NXT, and later Ethereum, Ripple's XRP, Algorand, Cardano, and countless other blockchains professing to be faster, more multifaceted, less environmentally harmful, or simply offering a different value proposition. To varying degrees, those individual blockchains could also stand up a claim to being a single source of uncensorable truth. But now we face a new dilemma. Developers might have created intermediary-free transactions on a per-blockchain basis, but if you zoomed out and looked at the overall crypto economy, and you noted that people were operating on different platforms, owning and trading different native assets that were unique to those environments, a picture emerged of distinct, isolated sub-economies. There was no capacity for all these blockchain communities to validate each other's versions of the truth. If you wanted to move value from one chain to another, or if an account in one blockchain wanted to read and validate data from another, they would once again need to rely on a trusted intermediary to convey and confirm that information. It was starting to look a lot like how the internet had evolved, especially in the so-called Web 2.0 era. You know what I'm talking about, a world where large social media and search platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, etc., manage the content, data, and identities of the users within what are essentially walled gardens. You want data about activity on these platforms? You need to go to the intermediary, the company that runs them. It's a monopolizing model that has empowered these enterprises and enriched their shareholders beyond anything in the history of capitalism. If you're a regular Money Reimagined listener or reader, you'll know that I think Web 2.0 is a pretty big problem. Anyway, many blockchain developers looked at this situation and said that we can and need to do better. They started exploring cryptographic solutions such as multi-sig notaries, sidechains, atomic swaps, and cross-chain bridges to allow different blockchains to essentially talk to each other in a decentralized manner without intermediaries. And now there's a booming ecosystem in interoperability solutions. You have protocols such as Polkadot, founded by early Ethereum developers Gavin Wood and Hutter Steiner, which is setting itself the lofty goal of creating the next internet via the aptly named Web3 Foundation. There are blockchains focused on financial interoperability, such as Ripple's Interledger and Stellar. And then there's Cosmos, the blockchain of blockchains developed by Tendermint, which provides a suite of tools for blockchain developers to build cross-chain applications. Today, we talked to two leaders from the last two on that list. We're joined by Denelle Dixon, CEO of the Stellar Development Foundation, and Peng Zhong, CEO of Tendermint. But before we meet them, let's say hello to my co-host, Sheila Warren. Hi, Sheila.
Hey, Michael.
So, interoperability, Sheila. What does it mean to you?
Well, I think there's one thing you didn't mention in your monologue that we've been paying quite a bit of attention to at the forum, which is, of course, this idea that despite what some may desire, not everyone's going to immediately move to a blockchain service or system or technology backing right away. So there's going to have to be interoperability, not just between different chains, but also between legacy systems and these new or new-ish, I suppose, at this point in time, blockchain systems. It's something we've been spending a lot of time thinking about at the forum. Not so much the technology, the technical elements here we're going to get into today are super interesting. There's some cutting edge stuff happening, but it's becoming a little more established that this is something that technically needs to happen. It's really about the enabling environment there too. What about the legal and regulatory and policy and insurance and liability questions that arise anytime something moves from any one system to any other system that are going to, I think, really be necessary before we see an explosion in the ability of information to move from one chain to another, or let alone from an off-chain to on-chain environment.
Yeah, and it kind of harkens a little bit to some of the conversations we had last week about, and the previous week as well, talking about DAOs.
Exactly.
Where there is this sort of need for some sort of hybrid solution that brings the real world into that decentralized setting. and there are trade-offs. So we'll talk to our guests and see where they lie and how they've resolved some of those trade-offs. But so why don't we bring them in? So Denelle and Peng, thank you very much for joining us. Let's just start out, if we don't mind, both of you. I'm going to ask, maybe to you, Denelle, first. Tell us what your definition of interoperability is, and then actually go backwards from that and tell us what is the core problem that you think we are trying to solve.
Yeah, no, those are two great questions, because interoperability means several things when I think about it, because I think about it back from like the early web days. And so interoperability is first, if you think about just making sure that you can speak the same language and that you can actually, that value can transfer very easily on chain to off chain, even if it's on a single chain. There needs to be interoperability with the existing financial system. We like to think of it as enhancing the existing financial system versus supplanting it. And so we need to actually have that kind of interoperability. And then secondly, it's the cross-chain interoperability, and that's sort of the building of the bridges. I think about USDC, for example, as being a really awesome way to demonstrate that interoperability, because USDC is available on many different chains. So it's a multi-chain, and you can do the swaps with respect to, they have an API where you can do the swap with respect to the different assets on different chains. And that's really important from an interoperability standpoint. And then, so those are the two ways that I think about it. Why are we doing this, and why do we care? And I think it's very simple, at least in my mind. If you think about the early days of the web, and we built the foundations of the web, and the internet itself are built on this notion of standards and interoperability. And that was awesome. And it took some time for folks to get used to web technology and to leveraging that. But once they did, they had access to so much information, and it was limited at first in terms of the players that were involved, but then it grew to become this like plethora of information that you had access to. And then we got to the place where we had sort of created these walled gardens and these silos on the web. And that was the challenge, right? Because then we actually have content that sits in a certain area. And then you no longer have sort of that interoperability, that promise of the web, that promise of free access and open access. And I don't want to see that happen on the what I call the payment side, or the financial side of the web. And so for me, it really goes back to the learnings that I had from all of the efforts that we made. I was the COO of Mozilla for many years, focusing on open technologies and on keeping the web open and transparent and focusing on standards. So I really focus on that from our work. And also when we speak with regulators about like this notion of interoperability, cross-chain interoperability, in as much as interoperability with the existing financial system, because of that early day work that I did in the web.
That's great. I love the passion around that, because I think that, what I was trying to get at in the monologue at the beginning as well is this sense that, like, hang on, we're building all these great solutions, but hang on a sec, are we not just recreating the same problems, right? And then for those of us who've spent a time thinking about all of that, and the Mozilla Foundation, of course, a really important institution in trying to address some of these issues. So Peng, same question to you. And clearly Cosmos has this sweeping, or the Tendermint, but Cosmos, but the system you created, this sweeping way of thinking about this. What does it all mean to you? What are you trying to achieve here?
Yeah, so I really like the way Denelle put it earlier, about how Web 2.0 is sort of all about, corporation controlled data, whereas in Web 3.0, it's all about user controlled data. So in some ways, with the right amount of developers in Web 3, there's actually no way, data will continue to be locked and only served by corporations and secured by corporations, right? With Web3, you are always allowed to exit. And, that is capable, that's something that's possible only because, everyone has access to the same data. Everyone can create protocols using the same data. Everyone can, build bridges with that data. The option to exit from any ecosystem that you're a part of, is really a tremendous part of, what allows Web3 to be what it is today. Here at Cosmos, we really believe in decentralization, right? And also in the development of cross-chain protocols. The idea of Cosmos was, kicked off in 2016, thinking about, this future that we would have today and, going off into the next 10 years, about a world where, every chain will sort of have its own, data, have its own database, but it's, data that's not able to be transferred to each other. So, we're seeing a large amount of new cross-chain protocols popping up, every month it seems. But Cosmos was really the first in 2016. And we have more, finished infrastructure and more things ready for people to use right now. But at the same time, it's also not, us sort of selling what Cosmos is, but instead it's us providing a standard that other people can use. And that standard we like to call the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, or IBC. We're positioning it in the same way that TCP/IP, exists in the web today. It's meant to be entirely, chain agnostic, permissionless, free protocol for you to use. As long as your chain supports relatively fast finality, which generally all proof of stake blockchains are, you should be able to implement IBC on your blockchain framework of choice, allowing them to communicate with each other.
So Denelle, I'd love to hear a similar kind of orientation to Stellar and how you're thinking about this and maybe how it works for some of our listeners who aren't as familiar with this. But I'd love for you to address that in a kind of use case context. And so I know that you and Stellar have spoken, or you have spoken quite a bit. Let me start again. You've spoken quite a bit that Stellar is interested in financial inclusion, and you want to kind of see a world in which moving money around the world is seamless, the way moving data around the world is basically relatively seamless. So maybe you can speak to why interoperability is so important to that particular use case, and also how Stellar is designed in a way to address that particular use case.
No, that's great. I think that from the standpoint of interoperability, in the first definition that I talked about, which is the on and off ramps, we look at a world right now where the financial system is got so many fractures in it because each country, each region, sometimes even within those countries, there are different financial structures that exist, and that it's really hard to get in and out of those. And so the promise of blockchain, and actually what's happening with blockchain today, is that you can actually leverage blockchain to be able to come on, maybe using the existing financial infrastructure, whether that be through a wire transfer or a transfer from your bank account into it, or walking into a store and using fiat and converting that into digital assets that you can then leverage on the blockchain. So you're engaging and you're working with the existing infrastructure. And then you can actually hold those assets in your digital wallet on your phone, so that you can then transfer them to friends. You can make payments with them. We have a company in Mexico where you can, it's an anchor in Mexico where you can actually, the holder of the asset can pay their utility bills. That's exactly what we want to get to. So we look at these use cases, and I like to think of them as very regionally focused, which is another thing that I think that the promise of the web back in the early days of the web was that it could actually have this notion of bringing up the regions, and everyone could actually have their identity and their content put on the web, which I think mostly is true today, although there still are lots of walled gardens around that. But blockchain, and especially permission and openless blockchains like Stellar, you can actually have these regional players that are building to solve the problems in their regions. So they're using this notion of interoperability to be able to enhance the existing infrastructure to leverage those on-ramps and those off-ramps. But then once you get on, there's this really awesome company, for example, in Africa, it's called Leaf Global. It's focusing on refugees who have sometimes they're outside of their home country for 17 years. And so they can actually take their assets, convert them into digital using the old financial rails, put them in a digital wallet, and then hold those digital assets as they cross borders, so that they don't actually have to have fear that they're going to lose the assets as they go across, or that it'll get stolen from them, and then they can get to whatever location they need to get to in a safe way. So it's so awesome to see these regional players solving problems locally that we might not understand and see depending on where we sit. And so the interoperability notion is that you can actually build this wherever, using whatever financial infrastructure exists in your region, but leverage the same sort of tools. I always say this, and it maybe sounds a little corny, but I'll just say, like, the existing financial infrastructure was built for the few. Blockchain and what blockchain can do, and the use cases that we're seeing right now on Stellar, for example, it's built for the many because everyone can access it. You're not restricted in access to be able to take advantage of these wallets, these other tools, this yield-bearing accounts, all those kinds of things. So I love what it can do, and interoperability is key to making that happen.
And it's also key, and it sounds like you've explored this quite a bit, in the development of local solutions. So allowing that kind of grassroots oriented, community derived solution that is going to be relevant to a particular community or a particular region, even at a particular point in time, but then allowing that to connect into a much broader ecosystem and not remain isolated. And that is a way, to some extent, of potentially in any way, or at least in theory, codifying informal networks that already exist in many places, where they sit outside the formal banking institutions, or the formal banking system, but they actually lack the ability to scale in any meaningful way because they are totally offline kinds of systems that operate without any kind of potential consistency in their underlying architecture.
No, and that is the thing that I love so much about what can happen with respect to, and what is happening already in these regions with blockchain. Gone are the days, I hope, where we actually sit in Silicon Valley or wherever, pick your technology location, and we build for everyone. Yes, we can build tools that can help solve problems for folks all over the world, but we actually don't know what those problems are. And so my favorite part of what we do is the fact that we have these regional and local players who actually really understand those problems and can help solve them in different ways. We take for granted that we have banks down the street. They don't. And we take for granted that we can actually walk in and get a bank account. Many folks are excluded from the banking infrastructure because of the fees that come with it, the minimum balance requirements. All of those things don't exist on blockchain. And so it's like it opens up a whole new world. And as I said, it builds for the many. And that's the most awesome part about it.
So over to you, Peng. I'd like you to just in a nutshell, describe, the Cosmos ecosystem and how it works. And also, for people to understand, what role does Tendermint play in this? I suppose some people might be confused a little and think, hang on a second, am I now having to just trust Tendermint's software? And, the idea that you've essentially inserted yourselves into this intermediary role. I'm sure you've got a good answer to that, but I'd like you just to be able to lay out how it works and explain that particular contradiction.
Yeah, so Denelle's comment about building for the many really resonates to me. It's what the founders cared a lot about. And me being, the first employee, I also care a lot about this. What is possible in a world with interoperability is, a world where people can, onboard onto crypto via Stellar and then, communicate from Stellar to another blockchain via something like the IBC protocol and allow them to explore the entire world, without a bank account. That's really cool to me, not having to need an address, not even needing, like a home address or a credit card or even a cell phone at home, but able to participate in this greater economy is really valuable to me. So what Tendermint does, we provide software. We're providing software called the Cosmos SDK. It's actually the world's most popular blockchain framework today. There's over 250 projects actively building on it, and 30 projects that are highly valued. In combination, they're valued at over 60 billion, which is the second biggest ecosystem in crypto, following Ethereum. And
impressive.
How Tendermint doesn't serve as the intermediary is how we offer our products, right? Cosmos SDK is entirely free and open source. You don't need to pay us to use it. And in fact, there are companies, like Binance that use it to build Binance Chain. And they're a bigger company than us and they don't pay us anything. So we're not an intermediary here. As long as you feel you can trust the code, you've audited it yourself, you can use it to build your own chain. And we're always finding ways to make that an easier process. Right. We understand that there are teams with less resources, right? Like Denelle was saying, not everyone is in Silicon Valley. Not everyone is a well-funded team. And the easier we make the software to use, the more people will end up using it, to solve problems in their city, in their neighborhood. So we're aiming to make the Cosmos SDK as easy to use as possible. Right now it's at sort of the level of Ruby on Rails. If you're a developer, right, you're able to scaffold some code together. But we want to make it as easy as as WordPress as it is today. WordPress powers 30% of the world's websites, which is really tremendous when you think about how much value it's been offering to many small players.
So I guess this leads to impressive growth in use and everything there, and I think that's we're seeing an explosion in sort of the development happening on many of these interoperability protocols, and so I guess that leads to kind of the next question, which is with all these interoperability solutions that are emerging, they are to some extent competitive with each other. And are we winding up creating new siloed ecosystems where everything is built on one interoperability protocol, can work with each, itself and not with the other ones? So are we going to see a world in which the tokens interoperate with each other? Is Cosmos, the Atom token, going to interoperate with Polkadot's token, for example? How do you both think about that? Maybe Denelle, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think that that's my fear. And yet I think that if we all focus on standards, we actually can eliminate that fear. But yes, I get concerned about that, because we certainly, in the early days of the web, we all believed that we were going to continue to have this openness and that we wouldn't end up with 5 companies controlling most of the content. But there has to be like a codified commitment to that. And everybody really has to be committed to openness so that it's not a winner take all model. I'm a big believer in the fact that each chain has value that they can actually deliver to whoever their end users are, whether those be developers or consumers, and that value should be exploited by those users. And to be able to do that, we shouldn't have a winner take all model. And I think eventually we got there on the website where we actually allowed this like winner take all mentality to sort of to take it. But I feel like here, given that we're actually all working on, we're sort of we're the technology layer, we're the internet layer. So it means that everyone should be able to have those bridges built amongst and between them. So I think that one of the things, when we talk a lot to regulators about CBDCs, for example, the central bank digital currencies, and one of the things I always try to say is, I would love for you all to build on Stellar. That would be awesome. But I also want it to be able to be leveraged on other chains so that you can create that world of interoperability that's really important. And that you can leverage the private folks who have already built these sort of stable coins and these tokens to be able to distribute across these different chains. So I think there has to be a deep commitment to it. And I see it today. We all talk about it. I think that we need to continue to encourage it at all levels. And so I think, yes, there's a challenge, and we could be, but I also feel like if we're working with organizations like Peng, who are building these cross-chain opportunities and these protocol layers that learn how to talk to one another, I think that we could actually get there. So we just have to be committed to it.
Sheila, listening to this and this idea of how we have to work together, we have to come up with standards and agreements. It just reminds me again of these conversations we have about governance, about how there are these principles that we have to have that kind of like live outside the blockchain, by which participants in the process have a set of rules by which they do it. And then, of course, I know the WEF's been doing a lot of stuff in this. You've got your Presidio principles. Yeah. Maybe you can, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. It's something we do think about a lot, as an agency, that we don't, we're an institution that does not obviously sponsor code or protocol or anything like that, but we do think about that kind of enabling environment, as I like to call it, in terms of like, what is the context in which all these things are rolling out, and what are the necessary policy levers that are going to ensure that there's incentive, to interoperate, to continue to be open, to continue to be transparent. And so in the spirit of all of that, to your point, Michael, our Global Blockchain Council last year at Consensus, I believe 2020, we launched the Presidio principles, which are a set of principles that we encourage developers, everyone in the ecosystem rather, to sign on to, particularly those who are involved in development and communications. And it kind of points out, like, what are the benefits that blockchain technology provides? And let's make sure that we are centering those ideas, transparency, accountability, governance, interoperability, agency, individual agency over things like data, which of course is a very Web3, concept and kind of moves in that direction. All these things are really critically important. And to the extent that we're not doing that, we need to probably be thinking about notice. The next wave of notification is going to be how decentralized and transparent, is what you're building on top of a blockchain, because you can certainly have the protocol itself can remain intact, and you can build something highly centralized on top of it that has like one tentacle, touching a blockchain. Should you be able to say that really is remaining true to kind of the integrity of a blockchain if that's not what's really happening? And so that was kind of all presaged in this document that is still very live and active. And in fact, we're doing a whole refresh on it, releasing it in a few more languages. So thank you for asking. That's going to be coming up later in the fall.
Peng, one of the things that, really jumped out last year was the news that, the Cosmos network would be integrated with China's BSN, the Blockchain Services Network. That's obviously understood to be a permissioned system. The Chinese government has significant oversight over elements of it, but that there's this attempt, it seems to me, to try to bring in a certain amount of interoperability with more permissionless environments. again, complicated balancing act. Can you tell me a little bit about, how Cosmos will work into that, and how do you, protect the openness of the system?
Yeah. So the way it's protected is without protection. Paradoxically enough, there are no ways that you can prevent, Cosmos to be used in closed source systems or closed enterprises. Just the same way, there's no way to prevent Cosmos from being used for all sorts of open projects. So Cosmos is meant to be permissionless and also opinionless. And depending on who wants to use Cosmos for what, they can do so. But through the IBC protocol, which mentioned by Sheila earlier, is it only something for Cosmos, right? Do you have to build on Cosmos to use IBC? No, you don't have to. And in fact, IBC is being worked on for Polkadot and for Celo right now, for other chains in the future as well, of course. But it's really, it's not political technology, right? You can do with it what you want. And the way you can connect to other chains is all permissionless and done on, done by the user itself. Right. So if someone in China wanted to transfer tokens, outside of BSC to a chain in France or in India, they're able to do so, as long as, the Great Firewall of China doesn't block that from happening.
So just to clarify, yeah, there is the opportunity to do something that would, seamlessly allow me to take my RMB, my digital RMB, denominated asset, and use the interoperability protocol connection through Cosmos to transfer it to another chain somewhere else. But at the end of the day, there could still be a blockade. Like, it's still basically the capital controls on the Chinese side will still be there.
It's like the internet today.
Remove that, and then we've got, it creates the rails, but the structure on the controller's side is still open. Yeah. Okay.
We haven't developed something like Tor yet for blockchain interoperability protocols. That would be really cool to see, but we're definitely ways off from that.
That would be so cool.
So Denelle, I was thinking as well, since we just mentioned, this role of a government here, there's this regulatory risk in all this generally as well, right? I mean, regulators like to have the identity of some entity that they can step into, and we certainly know that the way that, for example, FinCEN and the various AML laws that have been built around crypto have used those on and off ramps as the places to actually have the controlling factor. In theory, a world of decentralized interoperability gives nowhere for the regulators to go after, and we may well argue that's a good thing, but it certainly must be something that bothers regulators. How do you talk about that with governments? Because I know that you're obviously talking to a lot of governments in the way you go about this.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of fear with governments with respect to any kind of new technology. I think that, we've gotten governments all over the world very comfortable with the internet and with the fact that there are these computers all over the world that run this thing that allow us to be able to have these kinds of discussions online. And so I think if you think about it as a technology layer and the tech stack itself, I think we've been able to engage in a way to say there's no reason to regulate this platform layer, the technology layer, so the protocol layer, because it's very, very similar, and it is essentially the same thing as the internet and how the internet works. And these decentralized computers allow all of this speed and scale and this opportunity to be global. And so that's one of the great things I think about the protocol layer. I actually think that most governments, and I don't know, Sheila, you spend a lot of time doing this too, but I think most governments are getting the idea that and I say this all the time because it's so true, governments know how to regulate fiat. They know how to regulate money. And so any entity that touches fiat, which is essentially your on-ramp onto any blockchain, is already regulated. And so there may be small gaps and small holes with respect to that kind of regulation, and maybe new entities pop up that are going to be these on-ramps to the blockchains, and then that'll create like a need to be able to pay some attention there. But I do feel like governments are going to get more and more comfortable with this notion of there already are regulations that apply. They already know how to do this because they've been doing it for hundreds of years. And so I think that part isn't so scary to them. But what you pointed out was this notion of like, how do we follow the money? And that one always kind of, it makes me chuckle inside. I don't chuckle on the outside about this because I understand that that's a concern, but on the inside, it's just like, well, gosh, it's actually now there's an account, there's a ledger. You can actually see where it goes. where you couldn't do that for anything else. Like fiat was completely untraceable unless you put those little tabs in it that blew up. But then, where you can't really trace those across borders. And so it's an interesting dynamic to see. I think that, we just saw with the ransomware situation where it's actually they're going to use the entities on the edges to be able to find out who these people are. And is that a bad thing? Maybe if you're completely looking at a trustless world and you want to be able to not have to trust any entity at all. But certainly when you're touching fiat, that's not the world that you live in. And we know that that's the where things are going to go. So I do feel like the way that we like to talk about it, and I know and working on councils with the WEF, they like to talk about this as well. You have to talk to regulators and policymakers about what they're missing out on for their constituents if they don't allow this new technology and these new frameworks to come in. And that's part of you stop focusing on the technology stack and focus on those use cases and what's happening that's so valuable to the end users and the developers that they want to be a part of it. And then I feel like we can actually get there. So we've had a lot of, there's certainly still some headwinds, but I feel like we've been able to really move and progress in the right direction with respect to it, particularly outside the US. And even in the US, I feel like we have a lot of nice attention focused there. So it makes me really, I get very hopeful about where we see things. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, and I think that the reason why interoperability is so important, and this notion of not one player winning everything, is that competition and innovation are the reason why we actually are here with blockchain and we have blockchain that exists. And what happens is that competition and innovation stifles when you have a winner take all model or when you have too much government interaction and regulation. And so both of these things actually make it so that we can actually see all this regional value, all of these things happening in these local players. So I'm hopeful that when we even focus there, we'll be able to see that even the ones that want to win, we all want to win, by the way, I'm not saying that we don't, but we can win by actually making sure that we're doing the best that we can to compete and to provide an awesome tech stack for other players to build on. But it's okay if that player chooses to build on us and also to build on another chain, because each chain has their own value. So focusing on the innovation thing is really important too.
Yeah, and I love where you ended that, Denelle. I think Michael and I are really privileged to sit in a place in the ecosystem where we get to back the ecosystem, right? We get to back the whole thing as a concept, as a theory, and as practice, because we don't represent any particular protocol or orientation or approach. We are neutral in our orientation of the whole thing, deliberately so. But what I find really interesting, to your point about regulators, is there's this kind of in every context, I think there's a little bit of a have your cake and eat it too, right? Like you want this to be criminal money, but at the same time, you want to say that it's like, even though it's proven that you can actually track criminals and catch them using this. And these cases go way back beyond even the ransomware context. I mean, back to Silk Road, at the end of the day, Ross is in jail, right? Like that happened. And that, despite the whole kind of concept that this was super untraceable and you never find people, well, you know what, they were found. Or the whole environmental component to this, which, is a whole rabbit hole we don't have to go down today, because we've certainly covered that before on the show, and I know we'll again. But I think there's this really interesting, to me, it localizes around inclusion and whether inclusion is just a talking point, which it is for some in the space, and I won't name names, but there are definitely people that throw around financial inclusion without any real evidence that their particular product or service is being used in that capacity. But if you're really serious about expanding opportunities, there isn't a lot of choice. Either you have to blow up parts of the existing financial system that were constructed, whether inadvertently or otherwise, and we've discussed this on the show as well. So it's really a combination of the two, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, nevertheless, hugely exclusionary of large swaths of the population. There is not a good way of adjusting that system without pretty dramatic change. So the question becomes, do you then build something that can accommodate and is oriented towards those individuals who are unbanked or underbanked or in banking deserts or whatever, insert category, right? Whatever it might be, that gives them a chance to then create what ultimately could be an on-road into the financial system. And if you look at it from that perspective, the regulatory moment of entry into that system becomes an interesting thing to think about. But also, I think there's this theory versus practice concept. So there's this kind of like talking point in the crypto that like, well, we're going to destroy all of the legacy fiat system and it's going to wind up being this, all blockchain all the time. And it's just not realistic, right? I think there is fiat exists, it's going to exist. And so the reality remains that there's going to be on and off ramps from those systems, call them legacy, call them whatever you want, into blockchain systems and into the crypto environment. And you're always going to have the ability, to your point, Denelle, to apply regulation that we know is kind of tried and tested. Again, it works for some more than others, and it's logical in some contexts and not others. Regardless, it exists at those moments of on and off ramping. And so I think that when we look at what's actually happening and what the direction of travel is, it is not the total eradication of the existing financial system and doing away with all of fiat. It's actually saying there are going to be opportunities and people are going to basically vote with their money. They're going to move it into the system that provides whatever they need at that moment. And if there are geographies where fiat just does not suffice, they're going to use something, they're going to use crypto, they're going to use something else, they're going to use a token, they're going to use a system that's going to actually meet the needs they have as they move in and out of different environments.
Maybe a little bit more about China. So what is the nature of the, I mean, is it a deal? When the, I think there's this, a number of different entities that are sort of building that BSN. What is the structure of that relationship look like? I mean, is Tendermint actually involved in developing services for the Chinese users, or is it just they're just like anybody using the SDK and plugging in as they see fit?
Yeah. So
to add to that quickly, sorry, Peng, but just, I definitely want to hear the answer related to China specifically, but how do you think about building globally when big, massive players, right, have these sets of rules and things that are coming out that make that challenging? So maybe you can address both those things. But start, please, with telling us about what's going on in China.
Right. So first of all, with China, Tendermint's not directly involved. We have a partner called Bianjie, and they are a Chinese company, right? And we partnered with them in 2017, I believe. They launched their Cosmos blockchain, right, built on the Cosmos SDK, actually 1 week before the Cosmos Hub. So they were in fact the very first Cosmos chain, and they are the team working with China and BSN currently. So I don't actually know a lot of what's going on that front. And like Michael was saying earlier, they would be considered just another team that is building something with Cosmos technology. And to answer Sheila's question earlier about how to navigate these waters, right, where sort of every country, every jurisdiction has its own legislation around crypto. Some may be further ahead, some may be further behind. That's what Cosmos is designed for. That's what an interoperability protocol is designed for, right? Every geographical locale, every country can have their own set of blockchains that follow the rules dictated by their governments, right? And if they're not allowed to connect to blockchains outside of the country, well, then it's unfortunate for the citizens living there, but that's just how it is. That's how the web works today. That's how firewalls work. And if you are open, to being a part of the wider internet, like most of the world is today, then very similarly in Web3, the tokens that you hold will be able to be transferred across the entire world to whichever jurisdiction supports accessing your tokens.
And
so I think it's that.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a really elegant way of making sure that and encouraging governments and legislation to be more open to this sort of financial model.
So I think this ties back to a point you made earlier, Denelle, which is you can build with, not for, which is a phrase I say at my team constantly. Are you building with a community or for a community in the Silicon Valley model? You can build these very locally relevant solutions that are not just user-centric to that particular locality or community, but also accommodate whatever regulations and rules and whatever might transpire there. And then because of the nature of the protocol, those can globally connect to a variety of other projects and other initiatives that are happening in other parts of the world that might have a very different user base, orientation, need different design on the UX kind of side of it, but also have a different set of regulations or rules or requirements around whatever it might be, connectivity or KYC, AML, whatever it might be, whatever those rules might be. You can accommodate a lot of that via these interoperability, these cross-chain concepts.
Yeah, no, it's really important to have that. I think that what we have is built into the Stellar protocol is this compliance functionality. And so any asset issuer can actually have their compliance, for example, and when they want to do KYC and AML, do they want to do it at redemption? Do they want to do it at when someone actually on ramps onto and purchases their tokens? How do they want to think about that? And then how do they want to pass that information? All those things are built into the protocol layer, and it makes it so that each one can choose the mechanisms that they want to leverage. There's also the opportunity to be able to say, you know what, I don't want this asset to be held by anyone unless I've actually approved that they can hold this asset, so that you can have an authorization required, so that the token can't pass. I think that that's useful for some entities. I like the openness of tokens that allow transfer and then KYC and AML either at the off-ramp or the on-ramp stage. But I think that this is the whole point, is that entities have to build based on their own regional requirements and also based on their own needs. And I think that that is what's so awesome about having open permissionless systems. And so I know we've been talking about interoperability, but in order to really get to the heart of what we're trying to do here, open permissionless systems allows so much opportunity for growth and creativity and all those things that I got to tell you, I love my job, but I am not someone who could actually come up with the solutions that people come up with, because the problems that they're trying to solve are very different. And so the permissionless network allows them to be able to come on and to give it a go and to figure out how they can make it work. And I think that that's really, really important. So I want us to always, and I love the principles that the WEF put out, because I want us to constantly focus on, let's not repeat the mistakes that we made on the content side of the web. Let's not make ourselves put ourselves into boxes where we have developers having to develop for 4 different types of code base out there because they want to be able to have their app in all these different stores. Those are things that they should be back in the, whatever we want to call it, the history of the web. That should be history now. And we should be focused on how to build with languages and the protocols that allow this kind of interoperability across them all.
Yeah, and I think that the power of this, the empowerment that this really has, I'm sorry again, the empowerment this really provides to individuals and communities to really build and design solutions that meet their needs is something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit in our Crypto Impact and Sustainability Accelerator, which of course Denelle Stellar is going to be a critical part of. And the idea of surfacing these use cases, not just around, what are applications that are happening that are kind of helping with some of these problems, but also the method, the process that can be used to do that, and how you can create and embed even into the governance layer that community ownership of these different solutions. And so you give people the agency to design and make their own lives better. And to me, that's one of the most powerful things about some of the solutions that we're talking about today.
And I don't want to pretend that it's simple either. I think it's actually one of the things about building a network and then building an ecosystem and then making sure that you're open and that you're actually adhering to your open source ideals. It's hard, because you have to make sure you get participants to engage. We have our open protocol meetings, and we have lots of people who watch it and lots of people who comment on it and give us feedback on it. But we just started doing the meetings in the open about 2 years ago. That was one of the big things that I really said, if we're open source and we're committed to it, by the way, I am, and I love the openness, not just in this kind of thing, but also in everything that we do. So not just in our code, but in how we operate with respect to the assets that we hold as well. We need to really focus on it, but it isn't easy. And so I understand why sometimes people want a shortcut, because the shortcuts sometimes they make it's simpler if you can actually be centralized for a little bit and then try to move to open. But it's really hard to move to open once you've been centralized. And so this is the notion, creating those network effects, creating the impact that you want on the developers that are building on your network, trying to make it simple. We learn every time someone builds something on the network. We learn every time how we could do it better, how we could help them to integrate simpler and easier and faster. And so these are the things that we all need to be very, very agile in terms of coming up with. And so I get it that it's hard to be open, permissionless, and to want others to build, but we're a platform, we're a technology, and that's what we're supposed to do. So I think if we all sort of focus on what we are and what we bring, we'll see more value in the future in terms of how things are delivered.
So that's the hard stuff. What I'd like to end with here, because we've got time really for just one question for each of you, is the fun stuff, right? To think about the vision of the world that might come if we achieve all this open interoperable systems. And one of the things that I think has helped to energize the thinking around this is the sudden enthusiasm, because they're not that old. It's not that newer technology, but NFTs, right? And NFTs now are across multiple chains. You can be, you can issue on Flow. You can, obviously there's a lot of us on Ethereum. There's new other chains emerging. There are multiple different platforms, and you can't necessarily move one to the other, and you can't take your rights, and your rights are attached to one platform. It really is a bit of a mess at this stage. And so, yes, they probably have to go through something like, along with what you're talking about, Denelle, where the industry needs to come together and figure out what those open standards are. But let's assume they do. What I want to sort of ask both of you is to say, okay, what does all this interoperability mean for something like this idea of the metaverse, right? The idea that we kind of live these lives online where I've got this digital asset and it can be of any form. It can be, a piece of media, or it can be, a weapon from a game, or it could be a song, or it could be, money. And I can take it anywhere and I start to sort of like interact with that world. It seems to me that when we talk about this metaverse concept, which is really getting a lot of attention right now, it depends upon interoperability. So I'm sure you guys have given some thought to it. Zhang, Peng, I'd like you to just give us your sense. Where does this go? What do you see as the future looking like?
Yeah. So first of all, I think you raised a very good question, right? There are NFTs being issued on many different platforms that are not interoperable with each other. And, and there are people pretending to be other people and selling their NFTs on a different platform. These are big problems that we need to solve. And that's generally solved through, adoption of standards. We think that, of course, IBC should be that standard because we've been building it for so long, and because, we're funding people to also adopt IBC. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be the only protocol that succeeds here. I think in terms of the metaverse, though, the metaverse has many layers, right? And what that means is that depending on which ecosystem you're in, depending on, maybe what jurisdiction you're living in, maybe there are a certain level of NFTs that are censored where you're living, or maybe, the NFTs you hold are not allowed here. So you can imagine, wearing different sets of glasses that show you different parts of the metaverse. Potentially, I think it's really exciting, and I think it's the future. But the idea of multi-chain NFTs is really what allows for multiple metaverses to exist at the same time. It's going to be very confusing, but at the same time, you can imagine, at school, right? You wouldn't want everyone to be exposed to the same set of NFTs as at a club. So these are just going to happen in the future.
Denelle, your thoughts?
So mind is blown by talking about different glasses for different parts of the metaverse. This is the creative part that I love about what other folks bring to it. I think about it a lot in terms of gaming. And I think that's one of what you just articulated was one of those, like if you have a tool or something that you can use, a weapon in one game, you should be able, or you have a suit that you use in one game and you should be able to take it to another game. So it is something that I think that, I think gaming is the first place to see this happen, that if we can actually take this across different gaming platforms and be able to leverage those things that you acquire maybe from some independent, and then you can leverage it in all the different games, that's all based on standards. And that would be super cool to see. We're going to have to solve these problems. I mean, I think one of the things that Peng just mentioned is the fact that maybe in some jurisdictions, some of these NFTs won't be legal. We dealt with that on the content side of the web. It's not easy, but it's totally, you just have to deal with it. You have to, you couldn't show certain content in Germany, and you couldn't show certain content in France, and you needed to be aware of that as a platform. And so these are things that that's not going to go away. Those are things we're going to have to work through, but I think we can. But I love all of this notion of creativity. So I feel like we have a lot that's ahead of us still, and what can be leveraged and what can be developed on blockchain. Our network is very focused on payments and asset issuance. So we tend to be a little, and some DeFi stuff, but we tend to be on the boring side of things. We're the bread and butter, I would say, in terms of getting stuff done. But I think that it's so cool to see this technology used for all of these different things. And we love to see people building all these different pieces, even sometimes on Stellar, that I think, we don't expect that it's going to be part of it, but it is. And people build on it and they make it part of us. And so we're like, hey, there you go. This is the beauty of blockchain.
I wanted to add, especially on the part of NFTs and, KYC and AML, there is, the idea of decentralized identifiers, which can be implemented as NFTs to allow, let's say if you're on Stellar and you needed, to prove your identity to, an onboarding partner, that might be, stored on an NFT that can be transferred or carried with you, around the world, allowing you entry to, bars, on planes, et cetera, if you have a plane ticket, to show that you have a driver's license, et cetera. And this is one way that, regulation is going to merge with crypto. because the internet of blockchains is coming, and there's no way to stop it, really.
That's emerging of a whole. That's something we could take down a different channel. NFT is actually becoming this unique portable identifier and a carrier of information rather than just a piece of media. I think it's a really important point, and it just shows you how once you build this underlying foundation, you sort of flip your brain a bit on what these things could do and how they don't. I don't think we really have any idea what will be possible if we get there. But you heard folks from Denelle Dixon and Peng Zhong here laying out for us, that this is difficult. Interoperability is almost by definition really hard, and it involves not just a lot of development, but also a lot of commitment to standards and governance principles, and people sort of all pulling together for a common goal. So we heard that, and it was fabulous to get you guys to lay out the next steps that need to happen in that regard. But it was fun also to explore where it could be. The thing is, like, let's do it, because there's so much that could come from this. So thank you very much for your time, Denelle and Peng. Thank you again, as always, Sheila, Warren, and thank you all of you for joining us once again on Money Reimagined. Come back next week for another edition.